as hedonic happiness. Now, this idea of happiness was held by the majority of people, especially in the modern Western world, like Australia. And it is fair to say that anywhere between 75% to about 90% of modern people held this idea of happiness. Now, what is hedonic happiness? Hedonic happiness focuses on having and doing things that bring you excitement and fun and thrill. So if I can have a house in Turak, if I can have a Mercedes-Benz, go overseas for a holiday every year, if I can earn $200,000 a year, if I have a good husband or an obedient wife, or if my children are successful, or if I have the perfect job, if I can go to movies, parties, visit friends, have Iron Chef dinners at expensive restaurants, then I can have happiness. Or if I have status, recognition, and respect from others, then I can be happy. So hedonic happiness is more often than not dependent, not on the things, more often than not dependent on things that are outside of me, external to me, not an inside job. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that this isn't real happiness. You actually have neurochemicals like dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins exploding in your brain when you're on the Eiffel Tower in Paris, or when you're in Disneyland in Tokyo, or when you have just discovered a romantic relationship. You know, tell somebody who is having hedonic happiness that they are not truly happy, and when they at the end they will just laugh at you and say you're just bloody jealous. Okay. That being said, though, the sad truth about hedonic happiness is that there are just too many variables that are beyond our control to ensure that all these things that are supposed to bring you happiness will persist. Sooner or later, one or more and all of them may collapse. What happens when they collapse? For example, something like physical beauty. When you are young and attractive, like many of you here are, and people admire you, of course you are happy. However, when you become older like me and you put on weight, the wrinkles start happening when you're no longer handsome or beautiful. Okay? If by then your happiness is still dependent on your physical beauty and not something deeper, then that's the time when you'll start getting worried, anxious, how people think of you. You start getting depressed, you start going for plastic surgery, Botox injections, and all that sort of stuff. So if your happiness, for instance, depended on status and power, well, of course you're happy when you're a CEO or a managing director or a president of a company. Then when you retire, you might suddenly start feeling empty and depressed. Now, Hollywood is replete with stories of famous personalities like Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Elvis Presley, who unfortunately became so attached and dependent on their fame and popularity for their happiness that when it started declining, they started drinking, taking drugs, going on steroids, and the sort that eventually led to their demise or to their death. I remember reading, 10 years ago in Victoria during the Black Saturday bushfires. That happened about 11 years ago, about a man who had 8 vintage cars in the city of Dalesford, I think it was. He was so proud of his cars, Every weekend he would drive one car down to the marketplace and he would just sit down by his car and he'd watch people pass by and admire them, admire each car and, can see, cannot touch. Okay. When the bushfires came, all of them were destroyed. The only car that he could drive off with was his normal Holden car. He felt devastated, suicidal afterwards. So that's what happens with hedonic happiness when you allow your happiness to be defined by something external to you. When you're having it, you're happy. But when you don't have it, you feel miserable. The Buddhists have a lot to say about that. Now, this COVID lockdowns are a powerful illustration of the impermanence of hedonic happiness. Psychologists today say that the toll on mental health as people become depressed, start having mental breakdowns, anxiety attacks, and other psychiatric diagnoses will actually be 10 times more than the actual number of people who have COVID. Why? Because suddenly, all the hedonic sources of happiness, like partying, going to a grand finals, going to the movies, soccer matches, traveling, suddenly all of this cannot be done anymore. And if your happiness depended on this, then it is likely that you will suffer greatly, and many have. And that is why even in a country like Australia, which many people from other third world countries consider to be a land of milk and honey, the statistics on mental health are not very good. 1 out of 5 Australians will suffer from depression or mental illness. About 33% of marriages will end up in a divorce. Substance addiction is very high in Australia. 2019 survey showed that 43% of people above the age of 14 would have tried to use some form of illicit drugs. It would seem that people following this model of hedonic happiness don't really seem to be happy. Maybe the loss of the spiritual combined with increasing consumer materialism, has caused many to turn to hedonic happiness to soothe themselves. It is real. It is a form of happiness. There is no denying it, but it is nevertheless quite transient or impermanent. The other form of happiness that psychologists identified was called, as opposed to hedonic happiness, this was called eudaimonic happiness. They estimated that somewhere between 5 to 20% of modern people had this view of happiness. Now, what was eudaimonic happiness? It is a form of happiness that was qualitatively different from hedonic happiness. It wasn't based on external things. It seemed to have been the result of the cultivation of a strong inner life. Now, researchers found that people with eudaimonic happiness or well-being seemed a lot more resilient, a lot more positive in their emotional life, a lot calmer, a lot less stressed. They seem to be a lot more peaceful and wholesome in their relationships. They also seem to be much more physically healthy and happy with life, because we know that the research on stress says that when you are stressed, the allostatic load actually causes a lot of damage to a lot of parts of your body. You are about 4 times more likely to get a heart attack, 5 times more likely to get a stroke, 3 times more likely to get cancer, and so on and so forth. Okay, there's a lot of research on the allostatic load by one of our Australian researchers on telomeres. I think his name was Elizabeth Blackburn. So when researchers looked at people who seem to have eudaimonic happiness, what did they find out when you observe such people? Well, for one, they found that these were people who seemed to meditate a lot, okay? Or in the use of a traditional Christian word, they spend a lot of time in contemplative prayer. Spirituality was important to them. They often practice what psychologists today call mindfulness or meta-awareness. They practiced conscious non-attachment. They were seekers of wisdom and truth. They spent a lot of energy reading, browsing through the internet, looking for wisdom and truth. They valued a term that the Japanese call ikigai, or purposeful living. They practice compassion and loving kindness. They practice radical forgiveness. They try their best to live authentically without pretense. In other words, without trying to impress other people. So when you don't try to impress other people, you don't feel so stressed, isn't it? It's usually when we try to impress people that we become stressed. Like if I'm trying to impress you today, I'll feel very stressed. But if I'm trying to share, that's a different thing. They practice the attitude of gratitude. You know, there's in fact a lot of psychological research that say that if you can think about 3 things every day that you are grateful for, you won't suffer from depression. And finally, they practice ethical consciousness. I mean, not in a narrow kind of self-righteous way, but they always tried to live life by what they thought was highest. Ethics was important to them. So I'll run through the 10 again. They practice meditation, they practice mindfulness, they practice conscious non-attachment, they were seekers of wisdom and truth, they value ikigai, or purposeful, meaningful living, they practice compassion and loving kindness, they practice radical forgiveness, they lived authentically without pretense, they practice the attitude of gratitude, and finally, they practice ethical consciousness. Now, you might have more, but I think these 10 is what they found out. Now, it is fascinating that when you look at these 10 habits or practices of people, okay, they all look, who have eudaimonic well-being, they all look very much like soulful or spiritual endeavors. Now, initially, researchers weren't sure of what to call this form of happiness because it seemed to be quite qualitatively different from hedonic happiness. Then some of the psychologists who also happen to be philosophers said, why don't we call it eudaimonia? Because in ancient Greece, eudaimonia had 2 meanings. The first meaning was eudaimon, which meant the good spirit within all of us. And as I said, many of the early ancient Greek philosophers believed that there was an inner divine essence within all of us, just waiting to awaken. So they believed that going within to discover this wisdom was essentially the activity of the soul, requiring thoughtful inquiry, self-reflection, and honesty. And the second meaning of the word eudaimonia meant, believe it or not, the flourishing life, which is the topic that we are talking about today. A life of true fulfillment, of peace, of satisfaction, positive emotions that resulted from taking the spiritual journey seriously. And those of you who have actually taken the spiritual journey seriously will find that it brings a deep inner peace. I don't just mean, you know, some people think that to take the spiritual life seriously, it means going to churches and attending novenas and saying rosaries and all that. It can mean that, but it doesn't have to be restricted to this. Okay? So it wasn't dependent on things or people outside of oneself, but it seemed to come from a well-cultivated inner life. So for those of you here who want to know how to cultivate your inner life so as to obtain eudaimonic happiness, look at these 10 practices that I just listed that was identified by researchers. Seek to practice them rigorously, and you will certainly greatly increase your chances of experiencing the flourishing life.